Silver soldering mistakes. We all make them. In this video, I'll show you what these soldering mistakes look like and how to avoid them. I've identified 5 areas in the soldering process that mistakes occur. Let's take a look at each area and see how we can avoid bad soldering practices which lead to soldering mistakes. I'm Greenwood and welcome to my studio. The first area that can cause soldering mistakes is not having a good fit. All pieces to be soldered must have good contact with each other. Many of us sometimes get in a hurry and don't have a good fit for the soldered joint, or seam. Oh, I'll just fill that little gap with solder. Don't fall into that trap. Silver solder will not fill up gaps. Here is a ring with a bad fit. The 2 wire ends have not been filed properly, thus causing a gap. Trying to fill the gap simply does not work. This sheet silver seam is common in jewelry making. Rings and bezels use this technique often. This example has a gap. As you can see, the solder flows with no problem along the seam, but at the gap will only flow onto the back sheet. Even putting more solder into the gap will not fill the gap. Take the extra time to file and make a good fit to avoid this messy soldering mistake. Making a good fit isn't only for avoiding gaps, but assures our projects are stronger, smoother, and more professional. These 2 forged wires are only touching at a tiny spot, making a flimsy, weak joint. By filing a flat spot on both wires, this takes the solder joint from weak to strong, making a good fit with no worry of twisting or falling apart in the future. Round wires are often soldered together in our projects. If you have a flat surface and a curved surface to be soldered, file the flat end to match the curve. This avoids a sloppy looking soldered joint mistake. A simple trick to getting a good fit with different size wires is to drill a hole into the larger wire. Insert the small wire into the hole and solder together. This avoids trying to balance the wires with third hands and ensures a good fit. The second area that will cause soldering mistakes is not having clean metal. Oxides on the silver must be removed. Solder will never flow with oxides on the silver. The easiest method is by pickling. Grease, oil, polishing and buffing compounds, tape adhesives, marking pens and pencils will all prevent solder from flowing properly and must be cleaned prior to soldering. How can you tell if the surface of the silver is clean enough? A simple trick is to drop some water on the silver. If it beads up on the surface, then it is not clean. If it lays down on the surface, then the silver is clean. This is also true when applying flux to your projects. Cleaning your silver surface is easy. Use emery cloth, Scotch-Brite, ultrasonic cleaner, and simply washing with soap and water. Keep your hands clean also. Fingerprints can prevent solder from flowing. I strongly believe in having clean solder for each project. I clean and cut only enough solder for each project. If you pre-cut and store pallions in advance, they will oxidize and not flow as well as freshly cleaned solder. Flux coverage is an area where mistakes can happen. If you understand what flux is and its purpose, you can avoid many soldering mistakes. Flux is a compound that is applied to the areas to be soldered to prevent oxides occurring when the silver is heated. When flux is heated, the flux forms a glassy film over the silver surface. This glassy film prevents oxygen from the torch and the environment to touch the silver and form oxides. There are two different types of flux used in jewelry making: liquid and paste. Liquid flux is generally used on small and intricate work. It will easily get into the small joints and joins and is transparent, and you can see the joints and joins more clearly when heating. Paste flux is a white compound made of borax and boric acid. The traditional method for making borax flux is to swirl a borax cone and distilled water on a stone or ceramic saucer to make a paste. Paste flux also comes pre-mixed and can be rehydrated with distilled water very easily. A common mistake when using flux is applying too much. When the silver and flux are heated, the water in the flux will start to bubble and boil. This bubbling moves the pallions out of position and the solder must be repositioned. To help prevent the solder from moving too much, use less flux and heat the flux slowly. After the bubbling and boiling stops and the flux settles down, the warm flux is sticky, making it a little difficult to reposition the solder. Lightly heat the flux to keep it sticky and move the solder into position with a soldering pick. An alternative to placing the solder in position before you heat the flux is to heat the flux until the bubbling stops. Remove the heat and then place the solder. Be aware that the flux, when it cools, will be a hard, shiny glaze. The solder may slip off your desired spot. To place the solder in the correct position, it will help to rewarm the flux, making it sticky again. Then place the solder and the pallions will stay in place. Continue to heat evenly until the solder melts. Allowing the flux to become dirty is also a mistake. Don't use the flux directly from the original container. For both liquid and paste flux, put a small amount into a separate airtight container and use that amount when soldering. Another mistake happens when using flux and an anti-flow material like yellow ochre or correction fluid on your project. Keep the anti-flow materials away from the flux when painting on the metal. Just a small amount of anti-flow material can mix into the flux and prevent the solder to flow. Many soldering mistakes are made by incorrect solder placement. Not having the solder pallions touching both pieces of metal to be soldered is a very common mistake. If the solder is only touching one side of the solder joint when heating to the melting temperature, the solder will only flow onto that one side. Make sure pallions are touching both pieces. Another mistake is using too much solder. That extra amount of solder will normally flow out onto the metal, leaving a large amount of extra solder to be filed, emeриed, and polished away. This will definitely affect the quality of your jewelry. Placing the minimum amount of solder in an area that is accessible for cleanup is a simple step that will save you hours of extra cleanup time. Uneven heat is notorious for causing soldering mistakes. Solder is melted by indirect heat and not melted by the torch. It is melted by the silver heating up to the melting temperature of the solder, making the solder flow. If one side of the solder joint, or seam is heated too much and that side reaches the melting temperature of the solder will only flow onto that piece of metal and not flow into the joint or seam. Both pieces of metal must be heated evenly to reach the melting temperature of the solder at the same time. A trick to gauge the temperature of the silver is to watch your flux. After the flux becomes a glassy film, the solder will melt shortly after. This will help you determine the temperature of both sides of the joint to be soldered. Overheating is a big mistake while soldering. Not only will it cause uneven heating of the joint or seam with solder flowing where you don't want or need it, but it increases the chances of melting your project. Spillover flame can be a huge mistake when soldering. As you can see, make sure that you aim your torch so you are not mistakenly melting another part of your project. Soldering mistakes can happen to any of us at any time. Before you silver solder, remember the 5 areas where mistakes can happen: good fit, clean metal, flux coverage, solder placement, and even heat. When you understand what causes soldering mistakes, then you will be able to avoid them and have a great silver soldering outcome. Please subscribe and ring the bell. Your comments and questions are always welcome. Check out my website, greggreenwoodjewelry.com. I'm Greg Greenwood, and I'll see you next time.